Silence shows that the empath has already drained every emotional possibility. Silence is almost never the starting point of separation. For an empath, silence marks the conclusion of effort. It is the last phase that follows after every emotional path has been explored, attempted, and painfully worn out. Before silence, there were conversations, explanations, patience, forgiveness, and continuous efforts to mend what felt damaged. Empaths do not step back without cause. They are naturally generous with their emotions. When they care, they commit entirely, not partially, not guardedly, but wholeheartedly. They trust that connection can be restored through understanding, and that love can deepen through sincere communication. That belief is what keeps them holding on long after others would have left. So when an empath grows quiet, something meaningful has already taken place. Silence does not signal apathy. It signals emotional exhaustion. And before silence, the empath communicated. They voiced discomfort. They sought clarity. They revealed their hurt, hoping to be met with empathy and responsibility. Every discussion was an emotional gamble, an opening of the heart that could either repair the bond or intensify the pain. And still they continued speaking. But when those attempts are answered with dismissal, defensiveness, or manipulation, the empath's emotional energy slowly fades. Being misunderstood once is painful. Being misunderstood repeatedly becomes harmful. Over time, the empath understands that no amount of explaining will alter a pattern. This is when silence starts to take shape, not as retaliation, but as awareness. The awareness that effort is no longer building connection. The awareness that vulnerability no longer feels safe. The awareness that continuing to talk will only create deeper wounds. At this point, the empath is no longer fueled by anger. Anger still contains energy. Silence carries surrender. And psychologically, silence appears as an act of self-protection. The nervous system, burdened by ongoing emotional strain, chooses withdrawal to restore balance. Speaking demands emotional activation, while silence allows regulation. This is why an empath's silence seems peaceful on the surface. Yet beneath that calm lies deep fatigue. The empath has already practiced patience. They have offered understanding. They have attempted compromise. They have extended forgiveness. They have expressed themselves in multiple ways, softened their delivery, and even doubted their own needs, all in the hope of preserving the relationship. But emotional effort without mutual exchange eventually results in burnout. When burnout sets in, the empath stops reaching outward and starts turning inward. Their attention shifts from repairing the bond to safeguarding their emotional and mental well-being. Silence becomes the last remaining choice because every other one has been exhausted. And this is why silence from an empath is serious. Not intimidating, but conclusive. It means the empath has released hope for change. Hope keeps people involved. Hope keeps people communicating. Hope keeps people striving. Silence means hope has quietly faded away. From the outside, this quiet is often misread. Others might see it as punishment, pride, or emotional distance. But that interpretation completely overlooks the truth. The empath is not trying to cause pain. They are trying to stop experiencing it. By the time silence settles in, the empath is already detached from the result. They are no longer seeking understanding or reassurance. They have accepted that the relationship cannot grow in its present state. This acceptance is strong and lasting. Because once an empath reaches acceptance, there is nothing left to debate. They are not battling for the connection anymore. They are mourning it. And grief does not make loud announcements. It moves silently, internally, and profoundly. And this is why efforts to reconnect with an empath after extended silence often do not succeed. Apologies come too late. Promises surface unexpectedly. Effort briefly increases. Yet the empath no longer reacts emotionally, not because they lack forgiveness, but because they have already let go of their attachment. Silence has already completed its purpose. It has created space. It has rebuilt self-respect. It has sealed emotional entry. And once that doorway is closed, reopening it requires more than statements. It requires awareness before withdrawal. It requires steady and lasting transformation, not as a temporary response, but as a genuine shift in character. Without that, silence remains. So if you are hearing this and there is an empath in your life who has grown quiet, recognize what that silence truly represents. It means they tried. It means they tolerated. It means they gave more than they received. Silence is not the absence of emotion. It is the final proof of effort. Because when an empath still has emotional resources, they speak. When those resources are depleted, they choose quiet. And within that quiet, they begin preparing to release. And an empath's silence is not rage. It is emotional closure. When an empath becomes quiet, many assume anger is the cause, but anger is noisy. Anger seeks attention. Anger still desires a response. An empath's silence is entirely different. It is emotional shutdown. Empaths do not shut down because they stop caring. They shut down because they have cared too intensely for too long. Before the silence, there were talks that led nowhere. There were explanations overlooked, feelings minimized, and hurt carried privately. The empath spoke, clarified, softened their words, and tried again, not once, but repeatedly. And each time they spoke, they believed perhaps this time things would shift. But when vulnerability is consistently met with defensiveness instead of compassion, something inside the empath slowly begins to close. Not abruptly, not theatrically, but gradually. This is how emotional shutdown starts. Emotional shutdown is not a choice. It is a protective response. It is the nervous system saying, I cannot remain open where I am constantly wounded. At first, the empath feels uncertain. They begin to question themselves, and they begin to question whether they are demanding too much or simply feeling too intensely. They attempt to shrink themselves, to become softer, quieter, more convenient to accept. But erasing who they are is draining. In time, the empath understands that remaining emotionally open is costing them their calm, their security, and their dignity. That is when anger fades away. Anger still carries the desire to be acknowledged. Shutdown does not. The empath stops responding. They stop clarifying. They stop justifying their emotions, not because they no longer care, but because caring has become unbearable. This is why an empath's silence, when explaining no longer works, can feel distant. Warmth requires emotional openness, and that openness has been sealed. From the outside, this quiet may resemble indifference or retaliation, but internally, something entirely different is unfolding. They are grieving. They grieve the bond they once believed in. They grieve the hopeful version of themselves. They grieve the safety they never truly felt. This grief is silent and inward. There are no dramatic scenes, no loud farewells, no emotional outbursts, only retreat. And psychologically, emotional shutdown functions as protection. When the mind detects repeated emotional harm without repair, it decreases emotional involvement to prevent further injury. This is not heartlessness, it is survival. The empath's heart does not turn cold, it withdraws into shelter. They are no longer emotionally accessible because accessibility became unsafe. This is why attempting to provoke emotion from an empath in shutdown rarely succeeds. They are not holding back anger. They have passed beyond it, and this realization is deeply painful for those left behind. Anger can still be addressed. Conflict can still be resolved. But shutdown signals that the empath has stopped struggling for the relationship. By the time shutdown happens, the empath has already accepted that their emotional needs will remain unmet. They stop anticipating empathy. They stop anticipating empathy. They stop hoping for transformation. Acceptance replaces expectation, and acceptance carries finality. And this is why apologies that come after shutdown often feel hollow. Promises appear too late. Effort surfaces only when the empath has already detached. The empath may listen, but they no longer reopen their heart. They are not acting out of cruelty. They are acting out of caution because reopening would mean revisiting the same wound. And that lesson has already been learned. An empath's silence is not designed to punish. It is intended to preserve the emotional energy that remains. Once shutdown takes hold, rebuilding trust demands more than language. It requires patience, reliability, and consistent proof that emotional safety will be honored rather than expected. Without that, silence continues. So if you are hearing this and you notice an empath becoming quiet, pay attention. That silence is not anger waiting to erupt. It is emotion closing down to endure, and when an empath shuts down emotionally, they do not do so carelessly. They do it because staying open nearly broke them. And this is why the most critical moment is not when an empath is visibly upset. It is when they appear calm, silent, and detached. because that is when their heart has stopped extending outward and started guarding itself. And once an empath learns to shield themselves through silence, they seldom return to the place where shutdown was necessary for survival. When an empath goes quiet, they are no longer searching for validation. When an empath goes quiet, something fundamental has changed. Silence is not uncertainty. Silence is not delay. Silence is decision. Empaths communicate because they trust in understanding. They speak not to dominate disagreements, but to build connection. When they explain their emotions, they are offering trust. They are granting someone entry into their inner world with the hope that shared clarity will create closeness. So when that explaining ends, it is deliberate, even if it appears subtle and unseen. And before silence, there were endless efforts to be heard. Conversations that started with sincerity and ended in dismissal. Moments when feelings were shared carefully only to be reduced, ignored, or reframed as weaknesses. Still, the empath persisted. They experimented with new wording, gentler tones, different strategies. They believed that if they could just express themselves more clearly, more calmly, more thoughtfully, understanding would finally emerge. But understanding depends on mutual willingness. And when that willingness is absent, silence becomes the only honest response remaining. At first, the empath speaks from hope that the other person will truly listen, hope that emotional honesty will hold value, hope that the bond can be restored. But hope is delicate when it is not safeguarded. Repeated invalidation teaches the empath a painful truth. My feelings are not welcomed here. That realization changes everything. And the empath begins to see that they are explaining themselves to someone who is not seeking comprehension, only preparing to reply, defend, or reshape the story. And this awareness is devastating because empaths do not easily abandon the search for understanding. They cherish emotional transparency. They believe that being acknowledged and heard forms the core of meaningful relationships. But when their efforts are consistently met with resistance or indifference, the pursuit of understanding becomes self-betrayal. This is where silence begins. Not as revenge, not as control, but as recognition. Recognition that the other person is either unable or unwilling to meet them emotionally. At this point, the empath is no longer trying to be understood. They are trying to remain whole. They stop revealing their inner reflections because those reflections were not respected. They stop expressing their emotions because those emotions were not safeguarded. And once emotional honesty becomes unsafe, silence feels secure. And this silence is not void. It is full of clarity. Clarity that continued explanation will only exhaust them further. Clarity that understanding cannot be forced into existence. Clarity that a connection lacking mutual respect is not a true connection at all. Psychologically, this shift marks a turning point within the empath, where self-preservation finally becomes stronger than the need to be understood. And it signals the shift from involvement to separation. The empath withdraws emotionally before they ever step away physically. They start drawing their energy inward, protecting what remains of their emotional reserves. To outsiders, this may seem abrupt. Internally, it has been developing for a long time. The empaths already grieved the future they once imagined for the connection. They have already come to terms with the reality that their emotional needs will not be fulfilled within this dynamic. That acceptance is what makes their silence so strong and so decisive. Once an empath stops searching for understanding, they also stop seeking approval. They no longer need to justify their pain for it to be valid. They no longer require permission to experience their emotions. They recognize their truth and choose to guard it. And this is why efforts to reconnect with an empath after extended silence often feel ineffective. Apologies might be spoken, promises may surface, effort may suddenly increase. But the empath listen, as from a different place now. They listen without anticipation. They respond without emotional investment, because the longing to be understood no longer motivates them. Understanding once acted as the bridge that kept them engaged. Silence is the sign that the bridge has either been crossed or reduced to ashes. And once it is crossed, the empath rarely retraces their steps. This detachment does not exist because they lack empathy. It exists because they have learned the price of offering it to those who mishandled it. When an empath grows quiet, they are no longer requesting comprehension. They are choosing calm over constant explanation, certainty over confusion, dignity over self-neglect. And so if you notice an empathy becoming silent, resist the urge to immediately break the quiet. Pay attention to its meaning. It means they have reached the limit of trying to be recognized by someone who could not truly see them. And when an empath stops seeking understanding, the relationship is no longer being negotiated. It is already closing gently, steadily, and with deep emotional conviction. Silence is the final step before lasting detachment. Silence is not the start of the ending. For an empath, silence is the ending. It is the last phase that appears only after every emotional entrance has been opened, approached, and slowly shut from within. And long before silence arrives, there were words, careful words, hopeful words, exposed words. There were conversations meant to repair, reconnect, and rebuild emotional security. Empaths do not become silent quickly. They become silent last. Before silence, they practiced patience. They offered understanding. They extended forgiveness. They remained when it was painful. They explained when it was draining. They believed when there was little proof left to support belief. So when silence finally comes, it is not avoidance. It is closure. Silence represents the point at which the empath accepts that the relationship will not transform. Acceptance replaces hope, and when hope fades, emotional separation naturally follows, and detachment does not erupt suddenly. It unfolds quietly and gradually. The empath stops sharing intimate thoughts, stops reaching out emotionally, stops expecting mutual effort. They may still be physically present, but they are no longer emotionally involved. To others, this might look like composure or growth, yet internally, something significant is occurring. The empath is preparing for departure on emotional, mental, and energetic levels. This preparation cannot be seen. There are no threats, no ultimatums, no dramatic scenes, only stillness. Psychologically, silence at this stage acts as protection. The nervous system has recognized that emotional engagement leads to repeated hurt without resolution, so it reduces attachment to prevent further damage. This is not indifference, it is preservation. And empaths feel intensely. That intensity requires safety. When safety disappears, emotional retreat becomes the only method of maintaining equilibrium. Silence creates space, and space creates insight. Within that insight, the empath views the relationship as it truly exists, rather than as they once imagined it could be. They recognize patterns clearly now: imbalance, neglect, one-sided giving. This awareness dissolves illusion, and when illusion disappears, attachment cannot endure. This is why lasting detachment often surprises those around them. They assume the empath is merely taking time to cool off. But silence at this point is not temporary, it is conclusive, and the empath has already grieved. They have mourned the version of the bond they once cherished. They have processed the loss privately without drawing the other person into their healing. This private mourning allows them to detach without resentment or chaos. By the time they physically walk away, they have long since left emotionally. That is why they rarely return, not because love was absent, but because they learned the cost of remaining too long. Permanent detachment does not grow from anger. Anger still seeks answers. Detachment no longer requires them. Detachment is quiet assurance. It is the moment the empath selects peace over persistence, respect over sacrifice, recovery over restless hope. And once an empath reaches this level, reopening the bond demands more than apologies or sudden displays of effort. It requires a deep transformation, not as a reaction, but as a genuine shift in behavior and character. Without that change, silence remains a boundary. And boundaries that are honored internally are seldom reversed. So if someone in your life has become silent, not hostile, not dramatic, but calm and withdrawn, understand what that signifies. That silence is not confusion. It is a conclusion. The empath is no longer waiting, bargaining, or striving. They have already decided to release. Silence is the space where attachment fades away. And when attachment fades, what follows is lasting separation. Not out of malice, but out of self-protection. Empaths do not depart with noise. They depart quietly. And when silence becomes their final expression, the relationship has already ended. Anger can still be repaired, but silence means the empath has already let go.